So, everybody, glad to see you guys here today. And I am so excited to introduce to you Sonia Torres-Rodriguez, and she's a research associate at the Urban Institute. In her role, she works on AI and machine learning touches on algorithmic and racial bias. As an organizer, Sonia has served as an intern and consultant for MoveOn.org, where she has collaborated on digital organizing campaigns with their national organizing team to train and turn out volunteers during the national 2020 election, the 2021 Georgia runoff election, and the 2022 Rally for Democracy, and just recently, the 2023 25th Anniversary Organizing Summit, which we held in Atlanta. Sonia holds a BA in Mathematical Economics Analysis from Rice University and a Master's in Applied Economics from Johns Hopkins University, where she completed graduate work level coursework in econometrics, statistics, and machine learning. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you my friend, Sonia Torres Rodriguez. And the reason I say my friend is because I was able to lead a couple of co-lead a couple of sessions for the summit, and she was my trainer. And I learned so much about how to present and just the style of presentation from you. So I really appreciate you being here and spending your midday with us. Thank you and welcome, and take it away, please. And if you guys can remain on mute until it's time to ask your question or whatever, that would be awesome. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Miss Evelyn, I would do anything for you. So when she asked me to join, I told her that, to be honest, I was very busy this quarter, but Miss Evelyn calls and I'm ready to get into action, you know? So I've learned a lot from you. I think you're brilliant. I'm really excited that you're convening this space. And hopefully the next little bit, we get to spend a little bit of time learning about this new topic. I'm curious to hear your reactions because I'm learning about it too. So I'm hoping that this will be kind of a dialogue and an interactive sort of opportunity on this topic. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and folks should let me know if you can't see it. Seeing this thing that I'm going to move out of the way. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? Perfect. Okay. And like I said at the beginning, oh, great. Let me pull up the chat so I can see. Of course, Maya, no problem. So I'm going to skip a little bit of my introduction since you heard a little bit of my background. I think the only two things I'll add is that I'm originally from Puerto Rico and I grew up in Houston. And I think both of those two places make me think a lot about how minorities in the US, Latinx communities, Black communities are experiencing the world. And so I think a lot of that enters into how I think about AI. I'm always thinking about what are the ways that this new technology can potentially harm our communities? How can it impact our civic engagement, our organizing, our voting outcomes? And also potentially what are the benefits of it? So you're going to be hearing both of those two sides of it from me today. So let's get started. I actually want to hear from you all a little bit, and we've done a little bit of introductions, but I'd like to do a little bit more. So if everyone would humor me, and whether you feel more comfortable doing it verbally or in the chat, I don't mind, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your name, what city you're currently based in, one word or thing you associate with artificial intelligence or AI, and then one question you have about artificial intelligence or AI. So who wants to go first?
I always go first.
Go for it.
I'm Bob Schroyer. I'm in Illinois, McHenry, Illinois, northwest of Chicago. I work with Evelyn and the work we're doing, as well as the Democratic Party precinct committeeman as well. One word thing you associate with AI is imitating people, danger of believing that because you see it in video, you believe it more than anything else. The question I have is, where really is there benefit from this thing? I'm not so sure it's going to be equivalent to the dangers it has. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Who wants to go next?
Cool.
Go. Go for it.
I'm John Cavalunas, and I'm from Lakewood, Illinois, which is also northwest of Chicago. The word I would associate with AI is amazing, amazing or extraordinary. The question I have is, how do you control it for good and not evil?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, seeing some similar themes. Someone else?
Hello, my name is Charlotte Anderson, and I live in Cypress, California, which is about 2 or 3 miles from Long Beach, because most people haven't heard of Cypress. When I first heard of AI, of course, I thought I guess the primitive thinking. I'm thinking about robots, pretending they're human. But then I discovered it goes into more in depth where, which is frightening, I guess, to me, because they've already attacked the president several times using his voice to discourage people to go to the polls.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people what I think, and if it's wrong, it's wrong. And I'm just worried, somebody take my voice and go somewhere with it. But I think that's my fear. I'm worried about how invasive it can be into what did they used to say, the John Does of the world. That's my question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Those are great questions, and I think your fears are shared by a lot of people. So, thank you for sharing, Charlotte. Go for it, Cynthia.
I'm from Philadelphia, the Philadelphia suburbs. I had a large business with a toy business for a long time, and then it got larger with Amazon. And I saw a lot of the efforts, the early efforts, possibly not described formally as artificial intelligence, but recommendations by machine education, I guess. And I found it to be not very good. And nothing compared to experience and insight and intuition. So I'm still, your question is, what do I associate with AI? I question its capability, I guess is my thought.
And I think that's a very good point also, because we're still in early development for a lot of the technologies. So actually in the past year, you've seen a huge change in just like even image and video imagery that can be produced with AI. Maybe if we have time at the end, I can go look it up because I didn't include it in the presentation, but you can see the development, and yet still there's a question to your point of like, and is this exactly accurate? Is it as good as the prediction that a person might be able to generate? What are the times when it's not appropriate to have a computer generate and lead the prediction?
Sorry, the dog's gagging here. And in terms of the quick at the end here, when you're asking the questions, I have this philosophy that GPS is, for example, demonstrating the inability for humans to figure out navigation. And so we're going to lose an instinct. So my question would be, what areas of our human life experience will be replaced by artificial intelligence? That would be what I'm interested in knowing.
Okay, so
Awesome.
sorry about that. My name is Evelyn, and I live in Illinois, originally from Texas. And one word that I associate with it, just because of a little bit of the research that I've done, is lies. And the one question that I would have about it is, how much of the AI, the overall concept, is going to be an infiltration into minority communities?
Awesome. Okay, we have, I think, 2 more people. Mary, Maya, do you want to go?
I put my thing in the chat. I'm
Oh.
from Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm just basically very worried about every aspect of AI that I learn about.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. Sorry, I missed that. And Maya, I see that you also shared in the chat. from Chicago, and I associate the term deepfake with AI, and I work in an HR-related field and often hear the question, will AI ever take our jobs? And yes, we can definitely talk about that. I actually won't focus so much on the work element of it, but I'm curious to have a discussion about it today. So thanks everyone for sharing all of those thoughts. I think, to be honest, you've asked some very good and existential questions that I might not get to answer today, but I think that they're really important to have the forefront when we're thinking about why are we in the room, what are we hoping to learn together, and hopefully you get a little bit of background that helps you think about those questions a little bit more. So I mentioned this at the beginning, but I think I want to make sure that we have a basic understanding of the terminology associated with AI, how this new technology may or may already be affecting our day-to-day lives. And then I also want to end a little bit more on a positive note on how we can think about it positively affecting our digital organizing, although there's other potential avenues for it. So let's get started. I want to go through some terminology, and again, this is going to be a lot of terms. I'm going to go through 5 of them, but at any point you should feel free to interrupt me, and I'm curious about whether the explanations are making sense, whether there's anything I can provide more detail on. So just to make sure that we're starting from an even playing field, so artificial intelligence or AI. I think if you're intimidated by it, I think the best way to think about it is that it's a new and potentially useful technology. That's really all it is, right? We've seen new technologies in our lifetime before, like the internet, and it can bring a lot of very amazing things, and it can bring some really terrible things. So it's not as new as people are making it out to be. Artificial intelligence builds on decades of computer science and data science research to train computers to help humans be more efficient, particularly process vast amounts of data that, as much as we might want to, something that it might just take me years and years and years to process, a computer can do in a very fast amount of time. So again, artificial intelligence is this characteristic of a computer being able to emulate activities that typically require human intelligence. This includes things like recognizing patterns. What are the red things? What are the blue things? What is the dog? What is the cat? Helping make decisions. Is this amount too high? Is this amount too low? Those types of things. Some other examples include classification of images. Is this thing or is it that thing? Trying to interpret language. So trying to interpret what a certain sentence says or means or could imply. Those are all things that AI can help us do. It can include both supervised and unsupervised learning. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So supervised learning AI provides an algorithm with a little bit of information. So it provides some data or labeled data or predefined categories. And then it allows it to make patterns or observe patterns based off of that pre-existing data. So some examples of supervised learning are search engine websites that classify websites or news articles. Cynthia, actually, the example you gave earlier about like some of the earlier Amazon kind of recommendations that they give, all of that is an older example of like supervised learning. Like here is a pattern of a person's pre-existing characteristics. Let's look at other similar customers that also have certain preferences, and let's try to make a prediction based off of this pre-existing pattern in data that I have. And so we have people who have been identified as users, pre-existing preferences that have been labeled, shared with the machine interprets those, and then provides a estimation of what this new person might like. So that was a very good example of what supervised learning might be. Unsupervised learning takes that a little bit further. And so it's giving the machine a little bit more freedom, I guess, if you will. It doesn't set the parameters as much in the labeling by which it has to define a pattern. And so instead of you giving it a particular pattern that you want it to model, and then the computer does that, or a little bit of information for it to identify a pattern, unsupervised learning really figures out the structure of the data that you're looking at. And again, this is without you telling it a lot of information about the data. So it goes to kind of inferentially look at the data and make conclusions from itself. And then we have, I think, what has really been in the news in the past year and a half, which is generative AI. And This is actually a type of artificial intelligence that combines the two kind of elements of AI that I just described. So it utilizes both supervised learning and also unsupervised learning. And again, supervised learning, think of a computer just predicting the next element in a sequence based off of information that you've given it. And then also unsupervised learning, where it's figuring out structure and patterns that define the data without you giving it a lot of information. And so I forgot to ask this earlier, but who has heard of ChatGPT at some point in the past year? Maybe some raises of hands. Okay, some nods. Okay, some shakes of head. Totally good. I'm going to talk a little bit about it more. But if you have heard of it, ChatGPT is a great example of generative AI. So it uses both supervised learning and unsupervised learning. It takes large language models that are trained on large sets of data. It can take a pre-existing word or phrase and predict the next phrase. And it can also go look at large examples of like everything anyone has ever typed on Google. And it can go use that data to try to predict what an answer to your question might be. And that's more of an unsupervised learning pattern. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Questions on AI generally, the definition I gave, unsupervised and supervised learning, and then generative AI. How are we feeling?
Good so far. Thank you.
Okay. Feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'm going to add a few more terms to maybe give you a little bit more breath. So machine learning might be another term that you've heard. And again, these are all terms that are related to each other, but not exactly the same. So machine learning is a subset of AI that is particularly focused on statistical algorithms. So it's really like the math underneath a lot of the AI advances that we've seen. It utilizes algorithms and basically it tries to predict. It's the statistical methodology that either by calculating distance measures or some other form of kind of mathematical statistical measures tries to find similarities or differences between two things. And again, those things can be language, they can be images, they can be videos, and that's why we see a lot of these different applications. Natural language processing is also another subset of AI. So this is an umbrella term for any machine's ability to perform conventional tasks associated with human language. So anytime you're seeing the deep fakes, right, that we're seeing related to elections, where it's like audio deep fakes or visual deep fakes, right, like a video or an image, all of that typically requires language processing, particularly the videos that utilize text, right? That's the language element of it. Or text or robocalls and audios where it's like reading out kind of like a transcript of something that it's generated. And again, it typically relies on like text or language data to be able to then make predictions and then create something new. And so I think the last thing that it's important for us to think about, and this gets a little bit into Charlotte, what you were saying about this invasion of privacy sort of element, right? Is to really understand how the AI models are trained. Where do they get their data? And how does that possibly implicate privacy? So if we think about for a second, right, like an English sentence, for example, or a picture or an audio recording. And if you try to think about how a computer might understand these data, right? Well, if we think about an English sentence, a computer might consider, like, how do I interpret the sentence? How do I understand what it's saying? Well, I might look at grammar in the English language. I might look at punctuation. I might look at vocabulary to try to understand what this conjunction of alphanumeric things in front of me means. And so a period, right, signifies the end of a statement. A conjunction links words together and or but yet, right? And with that knowledge, we can try to interpret what this English sentence means. That's what we do, right? But this is the type of baby steps that the computer has to kind of figure out to be able to, at the end of that, be able to try to tell you what the sentence means. And better yet, not just what the sentence means, but given this sentence, what might the next sentence be, right? So that's the predictive element of it as well. To be able to do that really well, a computer needs training data. And so it needs hundreds and thousands and millions of examples of English language sentences to be able to identify patterns in it and then predict it. Same thing with an image, right? So think of if you're looking at, I don't know, an image of your favorite dog, right? Like your favorite picture of your dog. How do you know that it's a dog, right? Like to us, it makes a lot of sense because it's like automatically kind of like, of course, that's my dog. Like it's a memory, it's something that I'm visually recognizing. But for a computer, how does a computer think about that? So if we really break it down, right? A computer typically takes all of the little pixels, right? Like those little boxes in the computer that makes up that image. And it looks at the color of those images, right? When it starts identifying kind of patterns in shadow, in length, width of objects, shapes, right? That's when it starts compiling all of that information to determine this, all of these different shapes I'm seeing, ears, snout, eyes, color, this is probably a labradoodle, you know? So it's helpful to think about things that way. And so when you think about training data for videos or images, that's exactly what a computer is doing. It's taking, again, hundreds, millions of examples of images and all of the pixels that compose that image, using information about those images. So we know that this image is a dog, this image is a dog, this image is a cat. When I'm presented with a new image, is it a dog or a cat? I look at all of the images that are at my disposal, and then I make a prediction based out of it. And so the reason why this might relate a little bit to this privacy component, right, is because when you need that much data to be able to make a prediction, we know where that data typically is coming from, right? We know it's coming from all of our posts on social media. We know it's coming from all of the ways that everything that has ever been posted on the internet, depending on what type of kind of companies you're using. For instance, Zoom has come under fire for its AI transcription kind of service, having a little bit of unclear privacy guidelines about what they do with your transcript that they use to then train the AI to be able to predict transcripts or translation or to generate summaries of meetings that you've been in. So it comes with like a very powerful tool, right? Like I don't want to take notes during my meetings and the computer is automatically spitting out an example of what my meeting was kind of talking about, but I don't know what they're going to now use, kind of what I've said, my voice, how they're storing it, how they're getting rid of it, and what ends up happening with the AI that's then utilizing this training data. So anyway, I think that that's important to understand a little bit of how the underlying kind of elements of it build up into this model. So I also want to provide a little bit of some of that.
John had a hand raised, Sonia, and someone else.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, please. Let's stop here. Sorry, I missed that. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, on the natural language processing, says a subset of AI. So where does that fit versus generative AI? Is that a type of generative AI? It would seem to me to be so, but I'm trying to figure out where it is in the hierarchy.
Totally. Yes. I would say generative AI is an umbrella for these other different subsets of it. I think the big thing that you maybe need to remember about generative AI is that it includes both supervised and unsupervised learning. And so actually natural language processing, you can have both unsupervised and unsupervised learning. So I think if you have like really beefed up natural language processing, you have generative AI.
Okay.
And I think, for example, ChatGPT is a great example. It is a subset of AI in that it is using natural language processing. Because it has both unsupervised and supervised learning, I would classify it as generative AI.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good question. Charlotte?
My question is this. Normally, I guess when you want some type of software, you can buy it, I don't know, probably Amazon or go to Best Buy or some kind of Microsoft, something that sells the program, and you take it home and you install it on your computer and you can use it. Now, is this something that anybody can buy, or is it just for the government type using right now?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. So in the past, like 6 months, a lot of the really big companies have like open access kind of, not open access, that's not the right word, but like open for all users to kind of interact with their AI models. And typically it's particular applications of their AI models. So for instance, if you haven't heard of ChatGPT, you might have heard of, I think it's Copilot for Microsoft. Basically, all of the websites now that you're seeing, especially like Google, Bing, these like major Google, searches, web searches, they have new chatbots that you can interact with and like are very responsive. Those are not people anymore. That's like AI interacting with you. So there's actually a lot of ways that you as a regular person can interact with one of these large language models. I think the question though then is, can I see what data they're using? No, probably not. Can I see if my data is being used to train these models? Also probably not. There's a lot of other applications, and I'll talk about some of them in a little bit, that are not just like the big tech giants who are creating like these kind of chatbot interactive sort of places where you can interact. There's a lot of particular applications of AI to like medicine and housing and mortgage valuation and all of these other like very niche fields where that might be sort of proprietary or kind of more behind a company, if that makes sense. There are some government applications of it. Again, it depends on what you're thinking about, but it goes from everything from like the government trying to look at like child welfare case workers and trying to look at how they're compiling their notes and how they're writing about the different people that they're serving, to like trying to catch different cancers and like how they're developing, right? So like looking at cancer imagery. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, there are ways where you can interact
does.
with it. There are some ways that are more niche that are kind of behind, you know, proprietary or governmental sort of protection.
Yes, Sonia, I have a question. And I
Yeah.
was thinking about what Cynthia said earlier about the GPS, and I always consider it almost like it takes away my thinking, or allowed to take away my thinking. I don't, I'm fairly good at maps, but I don't have to think about that anymore. So I'm thinking about educationally, where students are still required to write essays or any kind of report for their classes. One of these components, and I would venture to say, knowing this generation that's grown up with technology, they're more inclined, I would think, I'm not sure, to use a system like this to where they can have their work checked or changed or some more acceptable. Which one of those components would be most conducive to them leaning toward using AI for that purpose?
Yeah, I think the best example is ChatGPT. And I would say that that falls under this umbrella of generative AI, which uses both supervised and unsupervised, and this subset of natural language processing. So the example that I will try to share later is related to, again, if you haven't played with ChatGPT, I think it kind of blows people's mind when you first interact with it. But the idea that you can give a computer a prompt and ask it to summarize something, and in 5 seconds it has generated like a 6-sentence or like 5-paragraph essay for you, it is like that doesn't read completely unreasonably like a person would write it, is interesting. And so yeah, I agree. I do think that from an education perspective, I think the most immediate place where this really was a challenge was plagiarism concerns. And how do you, like, at the same time that you're fighting against plagiarism, to your point, it could be a very helpful way to learn how to edit your papers, how to think about, here's a first draft, and then how do I make different iterations of that draft? How do I change the vocabulary? How do I change the structure? Why might we do those things? Like, in its ability to respond to prompts in some of these more advanced large language model, generative AI sort of examples, having that sort of semi-simulated conversation is actually can be a very helpful and educational tool. So there's kind of both sides to it. My partner's actually a teacher for college students and in philosophy, so a lot of them have to write papers that he has to read. And it's very funny because there are some that you can just tell, like the output that they get from ChatGPT is just so formulaic and so like like obviously a computer wrote this, like it says nothing and everything at the same time. So it's kind of interesting to think about the technology developing so that it's harder to tell. There's now services actually where you can plug in text that can help you identify if it's more likely than not to be AI generated. So that starts to get into examples of not only can we, use it and like be at danger of like falling basically for something that is AI, but also there's starting to be tools to try to like identify when something's a robocall, or when you're looking at a social media site, like, is this AI generated, right? Like if a company's required to tell you that, it feels a lot better, right? Like when they give you those little banners. And again, with this example that I was just given, this idea of getting a service that helps you identify whether text is more than less likely to be AI, I think is helpful. One last thing I'll mention about that, if you're kind of in the education space, is that I've also seen actually examples of the opposite. I remember actually when I was in 7th grade, I submitted a paper and I used the word that my teacher could not believe I had used. Like she was just like, how does a 7th grader know this word? This is obviously plagiarized, right? And this was way before, right? Like I'm not young enough to have been in the AI days in high school and in middle school, but there's instances of something similar like that happening in schools as well, where kids who are just like reading a lot, have really like vocabularies that are expansive and beyond their grade level, being accused by their teachers of using ChatGPT. And then it's a question of like, then it gets really interesting, right? Because it's like the teacher versus the student's words and not really like a clear proof of whether or not they did. Anyway, so it really highlights, I think, in a very commonplace setting like the classroom, like the very immediate issues and ethical issues that might come up with the usage of the technology, right? Like when you can't prove that the student plagiarized or not, right? And when the student themselves also can't prove or not because they just wrote it, right? Like they can't show you that they didn't do something. They can just show you like what they think they did. Anyway, it brings up really interesting questions. So I want to just give an overview really quickly of some of like AI in the news, if you will, to give you a timeline if you've kind of been like intimidated by AI and have kind of, I know that I do this, that like there's just like parts of the news that like I just have to tune out because like I can't hold it all in my head. I remember when all the like Trump hearings honestly have been going on, like I sometimes have to just tune it out. So in case you tune some of it out, here are some of the AI in the news in the past like year and a half. So I've been talking a lot about ChatGPT. I promise I'll give an example in a second. I probably should have started with that. But anyway, ChatGPT gets released by OpenAI in November 2022. And this is really when we have an explosion of everyone ever all the time talking about AI. I had kind of seen some people in my field and in my organization, like I would say like 5% thinking or talking about AI or even knowing how to define it. That versus 2 months later, like January of 2023, everyone in my organization knew what it was thinking about it, was thinking about how it impacted their work. So it's really amazing how this release by OpenAI of this kind of interactive portal with a generative AI model kind of really skyrocketed and advanced the conversation really fast. We start seeing the few months after that, this like big conversation about like, what is this new technology? What is possible with it? What are the harms with it? We see some top tech CEOs publish this very short 22-word statement about the extinction and existential risks posed by AI in the absence of regulation, which again is very funny because they're typically anti-regulation, and like what they mean by regulation versus what regular people mean by regulation can be a little bit interesting. But some of the CEOs that were themselves kind of ahead of this technology were talking about how, because of its black box nature, right, because the computer does not document all of the million decisions it makes to identify a pattern, it has a little bit of an opaqueness associated with it. And that to some technology people was very scary, right? Because you could have the computer identifying patterns, but not telling you how it came to that conclusion, which makes it a little bit hard to audit or kind of, yeah, I guess audit is the best word. See, so OpenAI is a nonprofit that got acquired by Microsoft. So it is now under Microsoft, and there's been some drama that I kind of missed last fall where like I forget his name, but the CEO of OpenAI got pushed out by his board, and then like everyone from OpenAI was like, we're quitting. And so the board had to bring him back, and Microsoft was like pushing for this as well. So it's basically now associated with Microsoft, but I believe it started as a nonprofit. So don't quote me on that. I have to go check, but definitely associated under Microsoft now. So in May through November of 2023, we start seeing multiple US and Senate committees, House and Senate committees, excuse me, being convened to discuss AI impact. And this is everything from housing to health to Department of Defense hearings to just House and Rules Committee on just generally the impact of it. In actually earlier before November 2022, the conversation was moving so quickly on AI that the White House published the Bill of Rights. And then a year later, on October 2023, President Biden issues the first executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy artificial intelligence. And that executive order is pretty long, but it really focuses on how do we create the infrastructure within each of the different federal agencies to document and audit and basically create a little bit of the beginning of regulatory framework for how we're developing this technology, because again, it has a lot of very powerful applications, but also how to start thinking about preventing some of the harm associated with it. Some of you have talked about deepfakes already. So Google, in I think September of 2023, begins to update its deepfake policies. So if you've been on social media recently or posts, you might see some like notes underneath your searches or like on your social media posts of like, it's likely this post is fake, right? Like that was like the fake news stuff from 2018. Now they've updated some of those on social media to say, this is likely AI generated, to try to highlight that sort of content. So Meta, the Facebook and Instagram kind of parent company, also updated its deepfake policy back in November. It remains to be seen how effective that is and the impact and whether it will be able to reduce what is the potential harms of deepfakes on the 2024 election. Interestingly enough, the EU has been a little bit ahead, particularly EU and or Britain, of course, Brexit, so they're now separate, but Europe generally has been leading a little bit of this more regulatory perspective with a focus on privacy. So actually they're a little bit ahead of the US when it comes to banning like websites, for instance, scraping particular characteristics about you as a user. When you go to a website, if you go to European websites, you'll get these long notifications about like what the cookies are and what you can elect to like allow or not allow on your computer. And all of this comes from their privacy kind of regulatory framework. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that we are not the only people who are dealing with this in the world. And actually some governments are a little bit ahead of the US, especially when it relates to this privacy sort of concern. So AI not in the news. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, the tech CEOs would like you to believe that the worst risks to humanity from AI are extinction related, like these mega nuclear war scenarios. And whatever, they have their opinions. I happen to think that the much greater risk of AI is some of the stuff we've already talked about. So the intrusion of privacy, what happens in the darkness a little bit, the potential for discrimination against people of color and people with low income. And so not to, raise all of our anxieties, but I think it's important to know some of this, right? Here's some examples of where we're starting to see the use of AI and algorithms kind of crop up. Predictive policing. So basically this term means when police departments take a lot of data and instead of just going to like a street corner or something when they get a call of like a crime having happened, right? The idea is how can we predict the places where there are hotspots of crime and have been in the past, and so where we are more likely to be needed in the future. So they basically show up before a crime happens, which again has some merits to it in that, it can be really devastating for someone to experience a crime and only get kind of like quote unquote justice or retribution afterwards. So like this interesting idea around predicting, right? But it can also obviously have like discriminatory impacts where like I just decide that like this random Black community at all times is more likely to be having crime. And so I just send all the cops there all the time. Like there's potential. I'm obviously being a little bit flippant with that, but just for you to know about these types of challenges society that we're encountering where big data or AI can be helpful, and some potential applications that we're seeing that might actually do more harm than good. Criminal sentencing as well, so judges making decisions about who's more likely to reoffend and whether they should be given bail or be allowed to go out before being in jail. Healthcare risk projection, so this is a kind of similar idea of like predicting who is most likely to be high risk at something. And so for instance, if you're a Medicaid patient, typically a company, third-party company decides based on your medical history how likely you are to like need a particular kind of intervention, right? And they make decisions about whether insurance will cover that or not based on your risk profile. Depending on the information that they've collected, right? Like that can also have inequitable outcomes. Discriminatory hiring algorithms, so algorithms that review automatically PDFs of resumes, right? And just like identify patterns on who are more likely to be good candidates and automatically rejecting candidates without someone really understanding why those candidates were rejected. Tenant screening, a similar kind of concept. Instead of a person applying for a job, right? This is a person applying for an apartment. And again, through a variety of data, criminal history, eviction history, and credit history, an apartment might automatically have an algorithm decide, yes, this person might be a good tenant, and no, they might not be a good tenant, but might not really be able to explain to you, or just because it's behind proprietary kind of guidelines or whatever, protections. They just don't want to tell you why you were rejected from an apartment in the first place, right? And so we have, and then lastly, just facial recognition surveillance. So like cameras and like airports or other places that are automatically identifying you from your face and from past images of your face that they have. We actually have examples of this already. I don't know if any of you have been flying recently, but actually now TSA has been moving to a facial recognition kind of software that just uses your face to determine if they have you in their database or not, and then they let you on the plane or not. So we're already seeing kind of examples of this. And again, it's very interesting that the tech CEOs have dominated this conversation, but there's a lot of potential uses or places where we're already seeing algorithms, big data, and or AI being utilized that are affecting a lot of people already and are of interest to some people, but not as widely and not as much seen as, like, to me, the much greater threat that is at play than this hypothetical extinction scenario. If you're interested, by the way, on some of these examples, I found a great book on this topic to be Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. It focuses, it's a little bit dated at this point, and it doesn't really focus on the AI piece, but it does focus on like algorithms and how big data is being utilized to make some of these decisions in our society. And I think it's a really good resource.
Sonia, I have a question, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah, please.
On the facial recognition, I've had my iPhone, I don't know, maybe like almost going on 4 years now. And you go through the process of setting up your new information on your new phone. The one thing I never set up was a facial recognition. Never.
I didn't either.
Yeah, I'm wondering what do they need that for, really?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is convenience, right? And like, again, from a purely like tech perspective, right? Like, you want your user to use your technology at all times as much as possible, right? Like, you make money when Apple makes money when we're on our phones all the time, right? Through their different apps and things like that. And so everything that makes it more convenient for us or feel more personalized to us, it is something that's interesting to them.
I think a lot of my hesitation, though, had to do with maybe I watched too much of the news. I don't know if this was true or not, but they say there's always someone who looks like us, maybe 1 or 2 people who look like us, and we're confused with other people who've committed crimes.
Yep. Yeah. So
that really concerns me.
Totally. And it's actually much more common for Black and Hispanic and Asian people to be misidentified, in part because of like similarity of last names, lesser quality on facial recognition, like especially earlier forms of facial recognition, like 4 years ago, was known to be much worse at identifying the differences in Black faces versus like white faces. Like it would identify like, I don't know. It wouldn't be able to identify Michelle Obama, but it'd be able to identify like a random sea of white dudes, you know? And so it was just like kind of interesting to see that development. And there's a lot of, Dr. Joy Buolamwini has done a lot of research on facial recognition. Perhaps because I'm paranoid, I also don't have either my facial recognition on my phone or my thumbprint enabled. Like I have a passcode, even if people can figure that out easier, like I rest easier knowing that they don't have that. So
Same here.
anyway.
Yeah.
And interesting, on that same thing, I looked at the reverse side. I looked at it as more privacy for my phone because I didn't want anybody to figure out my passcode. And
True.
it's also easier because I don't have to type in the code every time I sign in. So
Yep.
I flipped it to the kind of the opposite view than you two just did. So
Yeah, no, it's true, right? Like no one else has your fingerprint, right? Like it's your fingerprint. You would be the only person who would do that, right? Like depending on the quality of the facial recognition algorithm, and it was pretty good for identifying, right? Like you have examples of kids like who are trying to get into their parents' phone for whatever like prank or joke reason, right? And like needing to like go put the phone in front of their parents' faces while they're sleeping to be able to open it because they couldn't get it open otherwise. So like you have funny things like that where it's like, you know, kids being kids, but it's definitely a good example of like, you're right. That I think I misspoke earlier when I said like I do think that that was part of the original appeal probably was that this is more secure than like a 6-digit code. Anyway, so interesting questions to be asked here. I don't know how long I will spend on this example because I know I'm a little bit low on time, but I just wanted to mention Dr. Ruha Benjamin does a lot of work on this area of like racial bias in AI generally. And I know that it can be a little bit intimidating to think about the potential outcomes of AI, but I think the timeline that we've seen in terms of like housing discrimination and redlining and voting rights suppression, she makes strong like connections between the potential of AI to replicate a lot of those patterns through facial recognition, predictive policing, right? That like keeps certain people in certain communities away from other people, keeps them in poverty, tenant screening that prevents certain new tenants from entering into a community because they're automatically being rejected, right? There's sorts of memories to the past that are kind of being embedded in some of these technologies. And again, because the AI is utilizing training data based off of historical data, right? Like if it gets training data that in itself has kind of racial bias coded into it, right? Like a lot of Black and Hispanic people have terrible risk scores. Like hypothetically, if you were to put this Hispanic or like race and ethnicity kind of category, the algorithm could predict that those people are just less likely to be good tenants. That's not how it's done. Like demographics are not allowed to be in these sorts of processes, but you can imagine how if we know that criminal history and eviction data is already more racialized and there are more people who are Black and Hispanic who have those sorts of records, that they're going to be rejected at a greater rate. And then there's a question of, isn't that still some level of discrimination? So anyway, I'm not going to go into it too much, but I think two things we can learn from that tie that Dr. Ruha Benjamin kind of makes is one, that it's a possibility and it's a risk and it's something we should understand about not wanting to replicate and go back decades of progress that we've seen, but also to be inspired by our past organizing kind of history and to learn from all of the amazing things that we saw in the 60s and since then in terms of like collective organizing and being able to face big challenges like the one we potentially see with AI and be able to like fight back against it. So I also wanted to talk about some of the revolutionary uses of AI. So again, it's hard if you're not familiar with like what it does, but that's a little bit of why I gave some context for like, what is machine learning? What can you do with it? What is natural language processing? All of these different subsets of AI. What is unsupervised and supervised learning? Because when you know about that technique, you can start to see why it's so powerful and why it can be used across so many different areas. So I think the first, actually, one of the more common, oh, no worry, Maya, good to see you, thanks. One of the most, like the earliest, I think, kind of revolutionary examples of AI was using image classification, right? So I've used this example of like dog, cat, right? There used to be some of the earliest examples of that type of process of image classification with like flowers, for instance. That's like a very common data set that a lot of computer scientists have to start with. It's like 3 different types of flowers. How do they differ from each other based on like stem length and width and the flower petal length and color and all of these things? And what is this? And that sounds like a silly example, but then imagine it with like, you're trying to predict the nature of a tumor, right? In an image of cancer, and try to predict like its size and depth and all of these things. And based on those characteristics, what is the potential for like longevity and livelihood and aggressiveness of the cancer? And so those were some of the places where we were really able to identify like where cancer is, how it's progressing, and develop treatments that were a lot more targeted to it. So that's like a very good example of like life-saving potential of AI. Same thing with like new medicines, since like this development of like generative AI in the past 2 years, we for the first time have the like codex of DNA. Researchers were able to complete that because of the like sheer processing power that they now have with generative AI. There's been a lot of other examples. I'm not exactly remembering right now, but about a year ago, a bunch of researchers predicted a bunch of possible like medical combinations, like chemical combinations that could be like the formulas basically for prescriptions for different treatments. And again, these combinations would have taken researchers like years and years and years and years to potentially put together in the lab. But now they have like potential theoretical kind of chemical combinations that can act as medicines, and they can utilize that. There's some other really great examples related to like environmental monitoring and climate justice. Again, a lot of it comes to like, if you imagine like a city and all of the potential data you might have in real time at every second of the air quality, the sun strength, cloud coverage, rain, soil, like all of the things that show up in our atmosphere, in our earth. It's just so much data, and it takes a sheer amount of computing and processing power. And AI gives us the potential to do that. There's some other more like local, I guess, kind of interpersonal applications. I've seen some people try to use it for financial counseling. So this is an example of where a chatbot, right, might come into play. Some of us like really don't like talking about our finances with people. And this is not to say that a chatbot can solve our problems, but some researchers have found that people are more comfortable kind of giving ideas to a chatbot and things that they might be able to get from a person, but that they would not be willing to share because of like financial stigma or stigma generally, social stigma, sorry. They're more willing to do that with kind of a AI enabled model. So mental health support as well. Again, I'm a little bit skeptical, but there's some recent chatbots that have been trying to provide people with like real immediate sort of modeling the processes of a conversation and helping them in moments of difficulty. Language translation is another one that it can be done at a very quick rate in a very convenient way, right? And this can be very helpful in providing social services or things like that. So this is just the surface. I just jotted down some quick examples of how this could be really powerful. And I wanted to share those as well, because the story is not just that this is like a harmful technology, it's that it's a very powerful one. And because of that, it can bring a lot of possible benefits and harms as well. Okay, so I wanna kind of move a little bit quickly through some of these applications. We've talked about deepfakes, you know what they are. You won't be surprised that every single video you're seeing right now on your screen is a deep fake, even though they look pretty real. So all of these videos are examples of, they look fine, right? But when you start hearing them, you start potentially, it sounds like Kamala Harris, but like what she's saying doesn't really make a lot of sense. So doesn't really sound like something she would do. So anyway, you know what they are. We've already talked about them, and I just wanted to show an example of it. I did want to highlight maybe some of the dangers of it a little bit. So, but this was back in 2018 before like deepfakes were really showing up. But about 60% of people surveyed back then said that they had seen fake news or misleading information leading up to the 2018 US midterm election, and that almost 20% of them believed that information ahead of going to their voting place, right? And I know someone earlier mentioned the New Hampshire robocalls that were in Joe Biden's voice telling people not to go vote or telling them the wrong date of voting, right? So that's where we're seeing the very real potential implications. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think we've already kind of seen examples of how we can highlight this. I'm heartened by the fact that like on social media, you're starting to see some of the like highlighting of like, this is AI generated, which I think is very helpful. A lot of the examples that like with fake news and like identifying with it that we started developing back in 2018, especially if you're associated with MoveOn, a lot of those we can use in identifying deepfakes as well. So facial inconsistencies, is there an odd voice or a weird inflection? Weird lighting that you're seeing, is the shadow on a person's face placed in a weird way, or does it move really quickly in a way that's not natural? Physical distortions, especially in the background. The AI is usually typically much better at getting the face and the shape right, but things like the hand or like the plant in the back, they're much less good at. I've seen a lot of AI generated images that for some reason they all have 6 fingers on a hand. I don't know why, they just have a really hard time generating hands. So anyway, context clues, you know, like is what people are saying overly fantastical, outlandish, or out of character for the speaker? Gets a little bit hard when you have a speaker like Trump, but you know, there are some other people who are a little bit more predictable in what they might say. Most importantly, verify the source of what you're getting. So just because you get a call from someone, a text from someone, see something on social media, don't just assume that it's true. I think it's important to raise our skepticism a little bit and double check our information. And I think us on this call are more likely, I think, to be informed and to not fall for these sorts of scams. But this is where it's very important to know these types of tactics when someone else in your life is receiving them and kind of believing that they're true. These are the types of things that are helpful to point out as, actually, see this weird hand in this? Like, Joe Biden doesn't have 6 fingers, so we know this is fake. You know, it's just helpful to know those markers to be able to point them out to other people who might be falling for things. I'm gonna skip this. Okay, ChatGPT. So I promised you, I talked about it a lot, and I just want to make sure that I get to it before I mention it. So if you haven't seen it before, the example on the slide is an example of ChatGPT. It's basically this like online open source, you just have to make an account, website that you type in a prompt and it spits out in a bunch of seconds something that might be a response to that prompt in a way that mirrors how a human might have responded to that prompt. So as I mentioned, this is an example of generative AI. It's very easy to open up a free account. And this is an example that I think could be useful for us as digital organizers. So think of an example where you're writing a bunch of texts to motivate people to get out the vote, right? And you're feeling really tired because you've been doing a lot of canvassing that day, and you just want to see some examples of text messages that you can send out, right? If you see this example on this slide, and maybe I can read it because I know it's moving a little bit quickly, but basically it's saying, imagine that you're recruiting a few Latinas in South Texas to go out to vote. Use emojis and hashtags. Imagine that they're between the ages of 18 and 30, right? What are some example text messages that you might see? And so in this example, you see that ChatGPT just starts spitting out examples of all of the different text messages with all the emojis and all of the words. And I gave it some guidance on like the tone I wanted it to have. So I specified that I wanted to be a progressive sort of campaign. It's a vote tripling campaign. So the more information you give it, this is called prompt engineering, the more likely it is to give you something that is helpful. So another example is, and this one I'm less proud of, but you can kind of see what it can do. So I just tell the computer, give me some examples of federal protections for renters in a bulleted list. And it just starts listing out Fair Housing Act, Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, Section 8 housing vouchers, all of these different regulations, and say that, you know, I was just trying to put together a flyer for tenant protections. And I wanted to make sure that I was representing all the tenants' rights kind of in this flyer, right? So I typed in this very simple line and I'm getting all of this information that I can use. So the reason why this is not as good of an example is because one, tenant protections might have changed recently. And something that I haven't said about ChatGPT is that it cannot tell you anything about recent events. So basically all of its data stops at 2022. So if you try to ask it something about who won the South Carolina GOP primary, right? That just happened this weekend. ChatGPT is going to be like, sorry, my data is only as much as 2021, so I can't tell you that. Other times it won't tell you when it's wrong, even though it's clearly wrong. And this is typically called like hallucinations. Again, because it's using unsupervised learning to predict what a person might say, it can predict what a person might say to sound like a person, but with completely not factual information, because it's not verifying the validity of that information. It's just identifying patterns in how people speak. And so you can ask it something and it can very strongly tell you, very much so. It is very, I'm seeing the question about this or comment, this feels like an enhanced Google inquiry. Yes, very much so. Like it's why like Microsoft Bing is coming out with Google Pilot. Google itself now has a chatbot that you can interact with. It makes it really easy to have. And actually, I think you don't even have to go anywhere on Google anymore. I think you can just Google something and the top half of the searches are like the old websites you might see. And then the bottom is like AI generated responses to your prompt, right? And so, yes, it is very helpful for something like I'm searching something and it's gotten me a response kind of back to me. So I just wanted to end on saying some of the challenges with ChatGPT. And of course, if people have questions, maybe I can pull up the website and we can try looking at some live kind of prompting. But the biggest problems are one, it's not updated ChatGPT specifically in terms of timing. Two, generative AI generally in this prompt engineering sort of place can have hallucinations. So it can tell you something that sounds very close to reality, but it's actually completely false. And that's very dangerous if you don't know that, right, when you're looking at it. Going back to the example of teachers, like my partner has had people just making completely false claims about what a philosopher said, purely because ChatGPT told them that that was the case and they didn't do the reading. So they weren't able to capture like, this is kind of what this philosopher would sound like they were saying, but it's not actually what they said. It's just emulating the pattern of how they speak. The third problem is that it's very dependent on the training data that it has, right? And so if maybe not ChatGPT, but a smaller large language model, for instance, only has like Gen Z people talking, right? Like it only takes text messages from Gen Z, and you were to ask it to predict how like, you know, millennials speak or something like another generation, you would not be able to generate a good example of how those people speak because you don't have it in your training data. So it's very dependent on the quality of the training data. And again, that raises questions about how can we as consumers and users of some of these technologies, and then eventually when they start getting used in government or for nonprofit settings, how can we know what training data is being used and how that will impact the quality of some of these large language models, natural language processing kind of applications. So I'm getting close to time. So I want to stop here with a quote from Dr. Joy Buolamwini. Whether AI will help us reach our aspirations or reinforce unjust inequalities is ultimately up to us. And I think that really well captures and summarizes a little bit of what I've been trying to say today. So with that, I'm curious about some of your questions and comments.
I want to say thank you while people are thinking about their questions and comments. This was brilliant. Oh, I've never heard such. I've needed this for a long time. I'll say it that way. And I thank you so much for guiding us and giving us something to delve deeper into ourselves. So thank you so much. I'm not sure I can, because I'm a visual learner, I got to go back and read it again and again and again to really get to grasp what's been said. Okay, Cynthia.
A quick question, Sonia, what would you recommend for the future for us? Thank you for the explanation. It was very helpful extremely helpful. So moving forward, recognizing there's a lot of transition that's going to occur, how would it be easiest for us to keep up with learning the process on an ongoing basis in a simplified way?
I think that's a really great question. I think the first way is what I described was like a huge, right? Like it's huge, so many applications, so many different places to get information. And so I think it's helpful to narrow down on like what you think your area is going to be, like how it shows up in your, in your life. And so if you are someone who's like very involved in like Democratic Party organizing, right? Like how might AI matter and impact to you, right? Like you might be very interested in deep fakes. You might be very interested in like digital organizing, and then potentially AI uses in the policy issues that the people who you're trying to turn out to vote might kind of show up. So I have actually been subscribing to this free newsletter called Axios. They have like an AI specific newsletter. I find it very helpful. So that helps with like the policy sort of element. They've had that for about a year and I find it very helpful. So I think my two pieces of advice are like generally knowing like the policy elements. Like I think if you can follow like what the executive orders, what Biden's saying about it, what the House and Congress are saying about it, we can understand how it might impact our big issues. But if you find yourself like completely overwhelmed by like, I just really don't know about all this math, like this is very overwhelming, I think it's very helpful to think about it from how you might be impacted from it and the parts that you care about the most. The other place where you might care about it a lot is like as a user from a lot of these technologies, you might care about the privacy angle a lot. And so then you should specify on and focus on those, right? Like what are the technologies I use the most? How are those companies thinking about privacy and training data in AI? How do I want to make different decisions about my behavior based off of that knowledge? And ultimately, most importantly, I think, is there something that I think is important enough for me to like really focus on? So actually one example that I didn't give, but I will now based off of your question. There was this one, is it here? Yes. There was this one tenant building, rent controlled building in, I think, New York, where their kind of property management company just started using facial recognition in AI to determine when tenants were misbehaving. Basically, they were trying to utilize it to capture like bad behavior so that they could evict tenants. And the ultimate idea was like, let's get rid of all the like poor tenants so that we can bring tenants who like pay more money, right? And so this is a very localized example where like if you see something showing up in your community, in your like apartment complex, in your community, in your school, in your library, that might be the place, an entry point for you to really care about this issue. So this is another example where like you don't have to be an AI expert to know that like this application makes you uncomfortable and you don't want to take a part of it. Or alternatively, there's a problem in my community that I want to solve and it's, AI can be helpful for it. So learning about those particular applications. And I don't know if you're still involved with like small business type of stuff, but I think that there's a lot of potentially interesting ways that AI can show up in those scenarios. So that might be another avenue too.
Thank you. That was great.
I was wondering what kind of information you get if you ask AI, what are the dangers of AI and the benefits and what kind of information does it know about itself, kind of thing.
I think that last one's a very interesting question. There's actually been some people who've been trying to use, this is a very niche example, but just walk with me for a second. Appraising the values of homes, for example, automated valuing models, those use typically algorithms to predict how much a house in a particular neighborhood and based off of how prices in its area and based off of like the amount of bedrooms and bathrooms and lot size and the how old the structure is and blah, 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 all of that information to predict how much the current home costs. There have been people who have identified that those appraisal models are racist, and they've been able to do so by using other algorithms to kind of audit the behavior of it. So I think to your question, the algorithm is only as good as telling its own quality or assessment as we are at building the thresholds or auditing processes to determine that information, if that makes sense. I think that's my simplest way to think about it. Like, it is not a built-in intuitive aspect of a response. Like, you don't go to ChatGPT, for instance, the kind of terminal that I was just showing, and get a response of like, this is 93% accurate. Like, it doesn't it doesn't give you that, right? Like, that would be very convenient and very helpful, but it doesn't know that about itself. So it's a question of establishing different parameters, thresholds, statistical measures of bias and how it's calculating certain things, and us as the users or the people who are building those AI models making subjective decisions about what we think is good or bad behavior ultimately. And that's where it gets really you know, powerful, but also like really wishy-washy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of potential for error.
Thank you very
Yeah, go
much.
for it.
It's been helpful.
Yeah, good. I'm glad.
Is it worth it then, in your opinion, to get a ChatGPT account just to use it for general information? Sounds like you think it is worth it.
I use it all the time for particular uses. And there are some things that I would never use it for. So, for example, I code for my job. So I use like R, Python, Stata, other sorts of computer science languages to do my work. And there are some times where I'm doing a very particular task and I just do not remember what the command is and how to change it for this particular application or problem. And so I'm like, ugh. And I try to Google it and it's not getting me the examples of like exactly my particular use case. And so I'll go to ChatGPT and I'll type in my problem and describe it and even think about an example problem that's not the one that I'm currently working on. And then I will do a few prompts back and forth to try to help give me like this particular command that it might be helpful for. And that's way faster than me just like sitting at my computer, banging my hands on my desk, upset about.
Well, I think of myself as I age and get into medical things that I never had before. Is it worth it to trust that type of data out of the ChatGPT?
I would say no. I would say that it's for when you're looking at like particularly it's okay. Yes and no. I don't think it's useful for like, this is the word of God. Like this is like the accurate thing. However, when you say something like, say you got like a recent diagnosis or like some complicated medical terminology that you're like, I don't understand what this means. If you want to type it into ChatGPT, it will give you a summary of what it is in a way that's sometimes a lot easier to digest. And so as long as you know that there might be something in there or other that's like not exactly accurate, when it comes to distilling concepts, it's very helpful.
Okay.
And so
use it with caution, but it has a lot of, it has a lot of specific data that can synthesize where Google can't.
yes. And now we're seeing examples of it again built into the search engines. So it's, again, because it's identifying all of these patterns and like millions and millions and millions of data, right? Like it can use the terms, for instance, using this medical example, right? Like the terms that you are using as it has shown up in all of the different ways it has been talked about, and take a summary of all of the patterns of how that is talked about and spit it out back at you. And so for that reason, for that particular application of like, here's a very complicated medical concept, explain it to me like I'm 12 years old in 5 sentences, and it will spit it out back at you.
All right, thanks.
Go for it.
Quick question. When you were suggesting that when you're doing Google and it pops up the regular Google, and then the bottom would be AI responses, would those AI responses be from the from Google, their AI, or would it be from the Microsoft AI? Just
It's
thinking.
typically, yeah, it's typically from their own. So I don't, have to go look at it exactly. You might see it next time you do a Google search and see
Uh-huh.
it's like easy to tell. Like it says like this is AI generated, and then it gives you like a summary of like, I don't know, what is the mountainous range in this area called? And then it'll explain to you, you know, what it's called and give you kind of like a human-like answer for it. So
I see.
typically
this-
it's like built in from that technology that is like
This-
that company.
But this could be a pending battle between Microsoft and Google. I'm
Oh,
just
yeah.
from what you're describing.
Oh yeah, I mean, right, like we see that Google is like for many, many years, like the predominant Google search engine, right? And that has been the case for over 2 decades now. And you have the leader of like this ChatGPT large language model sort of competitor being a subsidiary or like underneath Microsoft. So very much so, they are all trying to figure out all of the potential ways to exploit this technology as fast as possible and make as much money from it as possible, because they know that this will define, just as the internet did, you know, 2 decades ago, like this is a new frontier for them.
Well, thank you guys for great questions, and Sonia for your extremely well done presentation. And I would say, I would like to ask all of you guys who are still on board, if you would, I was going to give closure myself, but you all have had a voice in this presentation. If you would give closure based on what you feel like you've learned today. And I'll begin by saying, you know, I use that word, I thought of it as a lie. And now I can say I felt basically uneducated. And you sometimes when you don't know what's going on, you just resort to saying whatever. So I don't see it as a lie, but I was extremely uneducated. So you brought that educational perspective today. And like I say, I still have to go back and study because that's the style of learning that I do. But I appreciate that, highly appreciate what you've shared with us. So John, take it away. What have you learned today?
Similarly, because I knew some of it because at school they've had a seminar just about a month ago about plagiarism and how AI has been a danger from plagiarism. So I knew some of the negatives, but I didn't really know the definitional aspects that you brought out, the more technical aspects, and the fact how we can use it. You know, we can use it and not be afraid as long as we understand what we're using. So I think that's helpful from my viewpoint is, you know, I find Google helpful. Well, now I'm going to find ChatGPT helpful, but I'm also scared when it gets better and all of a sudden Sync's fingers don't show up, but 5 fingers, and they get better and better and better. And I'm afraid still again of the misuse of fakers in the future as the technology gets better. So thanks, but you did a great job.
I learned that this thing's a hell of a lot bigger than I thought, and it scares me, I have to admit. And I don't know where I'm at, how much I'll use AI versus Google or whatever. I mean, I'm skeptical about all that stuff anyway. I'm one of those old guys who doesn't want to have this much change in his life. So thank you very much. I appreciate your education.
I enjoyed it, but I'm still skeptical too, because it would be good if we were living in the world that we had maybe 10 years ago. But nowadays, people aren't nice like they used to be. And this is a playground for them to exploit whatever they want to do to get out of you. They already do it now. But now they have a better source to make it even look even more like it's coming from the right person or whatever. So that frightens me. It's good if you do research, but it's not good if I'm just calling what I see them, the crooks that we have that are swiping money from people on a regular basis, especially attacking seniors. It's not good in that circumstance because to me, they're probably throwing a champagne party right now. You know, hey, look what we can do now. And that frightens me.
And by the way, I think that that's like a very important aspect of like, I haven't seen it really showing up a lot. Like it still seems to be locked away in this like wonky space where people are just like, this is just something the tech people get to worry about, right? But like what you just talked about is like so powerful and very much something the government can do, right? Like regulating how robocalls, how consumers experience this information. Like we have whole regulatory agencies that are dedicated to preventing scams, to helping people who have been scammed to get like payment back and like not be like victims of those types of situations. So we have the regulatory kind of set in place, right? And the FCC and a bunch of these other federal agencies are actively thinking about that particular issue you just mentioned. But I think it'd be very powerful, right? If this was something that like all voters were thinking about as like, you know, when they're polled, like this is one of our big priorities, like that would create a different sort of pressure on politicians, policymakers, and even companies who are developing this to be really mindful and careful and really thinking about these kind of privacy scamming, faker sort of implications.
Anonymity and in the concept of ghosting. I mean, I had a small personal experience with it. I was kind of startled because I didn't cross my mind. So Charlotte's right. The phase we're in, especially after the pandemic. For me, my little side hobby is studying evolution, and I'm always trying to understand what makes liberals and conservatives, and so the evolution of man, creating all that. But I'm fascinated by the penultimate effect of all of this, the internet and the AI effects, and what aspects of our instincts will basically regress. I'm just very interested in thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, which I actually didn't get to talk that much about. But I think the last thing I'll say on it is just that, again, for instance, when you take like writing, for example, ChatGPT could make us really bad writers. Like it can make us all sound exactly the same. It can all make us very unoriginal, very kind of a particular sort of tone that is, and on the flip side of it, if we use it correctly, it can help us like by putting in a paragraph and us guiding it in how it's shaping and making the ultimate decisions on how that paragraph looks like, help us become better writers as well. And so it is a little bit of like, it's a little bit difficult when you see new technologies and you see the obvious horrible ways that it can be applied somehow be the easiest and first places where you see like the fact that we see so many deepfakes and saw them so immediately after ChatGPT. I think it's just to know how these technologies, for some reason, the playground for them and like their evolution somehow seems to always be a little bit of these harmful applications. But how powerful would it be if we had the imagination to think about this new powerful technology and really push it forward with like much more helpful and beneficial sort of kind of presentations of it.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate that. And our recording is going to be uploaded to our YouTube page. And I don't know, I think everybody has access to it, maybe except Charlotte and Cynthia. If you guys, would you like to have access to it?
Sure, I would love to. Sure, thank you.
All right, I'm just going to put our email in the chat then, and that way you'll be on my list and I will share it with you.
All right, thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
I want to be linked into that also.
I'm going to put the email in the chat and you will be. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great.
All right, good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thanks. Thank you so much, Sonia. Really, really appreciate it.
You got it. Anytime.
Have a good one.
You too.
Give me just a second.
No problem.
Okay.
Charlotte, I think you're probably already on this list.
Oh, okay.
But just in case you're not, go ahead and take it down.
Okay. And it's not coming up on the chat yet.
It should in a minute.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. And so all of the other, we have a number of recordings too that are already there that might interest you as well. So once you send me your email address, and I will link you to our YouTube page. And we also have a web page too.
Oh,
So if
wow.
you just want to have
Okay.
access to all of that, then I can do
Yes.
that.
I would
Yeah,
too. I would too. I used to do a lot of organizing for Move On pre-Obama for several years, and I'd love to see what you guys are doing.
Yeah, this is not a Move On event, though. I just simply post on their page. We're independent. This is a group
Oh.
that I organized. I'm gonna stop the recording.